Hey everybody, welcome back to Be Like Christ. We're talking about Matthew chapter 11 today. And if you haven't already, go out to the website and get the notes, links down below. Also, free ebook. Can't remember where I put that thing. But if you want some foundational information on the Bible, check out the book, What is the Bible? On our website as a free ebook. You can also get hard copy on Amazon.com. And it will really help you get a foundational knowledge of the scriptures before you begin this study with us. Also, this video series is also now available on podcast, and I wanted to do that to make it a little bit more convenient to access for a lot of people. So this is going to be available, or it is available currently on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean. I think there's another one, but I can't remember what it is. And so most of the podcast apps out there, it's now available on. You can go out and subscribe. I'll put a little picture over here, maybe how to do that on Apple Podcasts, but that way you can have the audio of this, and you can also have the notes anytime you want those and listen to them in your car, wherever. Please don't read the notes while you're in your car, but I mean, if you want to, if you're committed, no, just kidding. Don't do that. Matthew chapter 11. Is what we're talking about today. There's a lot in this chapter. Let's get to it. So verse 1, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to preach and teach in their cities. So remember in Matthew chapter 10, we've just concluded Jesus talking to his 12 apostles, sending them out on what is sometimes referred to as the limited commission, or the sending them out to the Jews to preach that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so you notice, I love that Jesus here is not only a mentor, not only a teacher in his words, but he's also a practitioner of the same mission given to his apostles. As we just talked about in the last chapter, he's just sent them out, and he's warned them about a few things, the persecution that they're going to face, but also the promises of God that are going to protect them. And instead of just sitting around and waiting for his apostles to show back up again after they've completed what they've done, Jesus also goes out into the nearby cities and preaches the kingdom of heaven. So we see a teacher, but also a practitioner. Verses 2 through 6. Now when Jesus heard in prison about the deeds of, let's try that again. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Let's look at verses 2 through 5 to begin with. John had been in prison since chapter 4, verse 12. We don't know exactly how long that had been, probably a few months, maybe a few years at the most, but probably not. We don't know. How about that? We'll stick with that. He sends his followers to ask Jesus if he is indeed the promised and prophesied Messiah. And that can be a bit strange for somebody who's gone through the study. And maybe if you've gone through the study with us, you remember John. He had actually confirmed Jesus' identity when Jesus came to be baptized by him. And he had heard the voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So we have a question. Why is John no longer confident? It seems kind of odd, doesn't it? You say one thing in one chapter, you say another thing in another chapter. You have these doubts. You have to send people to Jesus to confirm. I think the answer is that, the answer can be found in John's circumstances. It's one thing to intellectually acknowledge a fact, especially when things in your life are going well. But it's difficult when hardship tests us and when we're discouraged and when doubts are introduced. Even those things that we once very confidently affirmed can be thrown into doubt when the circumstances of our lives are different. We don't know how long John had been in prison, but it may have been the case that his tough circumstances led him to doubt that maybe this wasn't right to begin with. And so I don't think there's definitely not any John wasn't being fake when he confirmed Jesus in the first place. I think if we all put ourselves into this situation, maybe you've been through a situation where current circumstances cause you to doubt previously held beliefs, you're able to understand what's going on here. John is a human being, like any other human being. And tough times perhaps have led him to some doubts. And Jesus responds to him, and I like the way that Jesus responds. He doesn't condemn him for doubting. He doesn't say, well, you should have known better. I mean, you baptized me all those days ago. You baptized me. How can you doubt now? Oh, you have little faith. He doesn't say that John needs to have more faith. Instead, Jesus points John to evidence. Jesus was preaching the coming of the kingdom. Jesus had visible and verifiable proof that he was who he said he was, that provided the evidence to back up his claim. So what does he say to John, or to John's disciples? He says, go and tell John what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, lepers are cleansed, deaf hear, dead are raised, the poor have the good news preached to them. These are all evidences that I'm who I say I am. And so he gives them these facts. I think there's an interesting application there, and that is that sometimes facts and hard evidence, visible evidence, can be the most comforting thing to a person whose faith has been shaken. There's a lot of people who think that facts are just cold, they're impersonal, that people need you to just be gentle and give them kind of an emotional encouragement or an emotional support. And I think that's true sometimes. There's sometimes when the facts are not going to help someone, that they're aware of them, right? And they're going through some emotional struggle. There's definitely a time when facts aren't right. But I think this points to the fact that sometimes facts are exactly what people need. I know that personally sometimes when I get emotionally overwhelmed with anxieties or with discouragement or with doubt of some kind, that sometimes the best thing for me is to return to the facts that I know, to return to the facts that point me to the existence of God, that lead me to believe that affirm my confidence in that, and that affirm that the Bible can be trusted, that it's inspired, that there's evidence behind it, that there's good reason to believe the promises that are in there. And a lot of times, when I get those facts straight, and I again remind myself of the evidence of why I believe them, then the emotional things will begin to sort themselves out. The unreasonable doubts will begin to sort themselves out. And what I need is facts. And here, I think that's what John needs. He says, point him to the evidence. John will know that these are the things that are supposed to accompany the Messiah, and they will reaffirm him in his confidence. So this is why studying apologetics can be really beneficial, because if you don't have a strong apologetic foundation, if you don't know why you believe what you believe, then when your emotions go all haywire, there's nothing to return to, right? There's no foundation in which you can return to as to why you believe what you believe, and you have the danger of going off in basically any direction in which you could find some kind of relief for your present distress. So studying apologetics will give you kind of that foundation on real, provable facts and evidence. It's not wrong to have doubts, and I think that's also an important thing here. When we do, I think God encourages us to look to the same direction that he pointed John in, and that is the evidence. We don't serve a God who's afraid of being fact-checked, and that's important. Christianity is not, as so many say, based on nothing but blind faith, and you just have to believe it because there's no evidence to prove it. That's not at all in any way what God has asked us to believe in the scriptures. And so studying the facts behind the biblical narrative are extraordinarily important, and they will secure us in times of difficulty. So look at verse 6. Many find offense, or let me read that again actually, just to remind us of what it is. Jesus says at the very end of this paragraph, "And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." He says, look at the evidence, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me. So what does that mean? Many find offense in Jesus rather than salvation. Instead of making him a foundation and a rock on which we build our lives, or they build their lives, they stumble over him and curse because he's just something that's in their way. Jesus is maybe a hindrance to them being allowed to live the way that they want to live. His influence is in a culture that is keeping them from It's just in their way from becoming who they want to be, right? They find offense at Jesus. And there are many who had witnessed the same miracles that John and his disciples had witnessed, and that Jesus now uses as evidence for John's doubts, and they still rejected him because of some offense. What could that have been? Maybe it was the way that he looked, or they rejected him because of his background, or his teaching stepped on their toes, or he wasn't the Messiah that they had dreamed up in their minds, and so they've found some offense. I looked up that word offense. I thought the definition was really interesting. It is, to be offended is annoyance or resentment brought about by a perceived insult to or disregard for oneself or one's standards or principles. Let me read that one more time. It's in your notes. Offense is annoyance or resentment brought about by a perceived insult to or disregard for, and notice this last part, disregard for oneself or one's standards or principles. That's important. You're offended when somebody tramples on your principles. Why I think this is important is because some people can reject clear conclusions of evidence when they find it offensive to their personal principles. I think two things really stand in the way of a lot of people accepting the gospel. The first one is they have to realize that there's a God who's greater than themselves. The second one is they have to realize that that God being greater than themselves, his principles are greater than their personal principles. And so a neglect of those two truths, well, I don't want to touch on that point yet, but going back to that idea that we just talked about, we have to be able to recognize that there's a God who's greater than us and his principles are greater than ours. Many people take offense when personally their principles are stepped on by a teacher of the gospel, by someone who's communicating God's principles to them. And they're offended because they don't yet have an understanding or an appreciation or a desire to understand that God is greater than them and his principles should supersede our own. And so many people find offense at the teaching of Christ's principles. You think about it, in our culture, that's very prominent. And a neglect of recognizing God's principles to be superior to ours permits liberal doctrinal decisions to sneak into a lot of churches. Because when I use that term liberal in parentheses there in the notes, it's not my favorite word, but I think everyone understands what I mean when I say it. That is that, how is it that churches are so divided on things that the Bible speaks very clearly about, like homosexuality? There's churches that accept it, there's people who reject it. How is it that someone can make a doctrinal decision when homosexuality is very clearly condemned in the Bible that, their church is actually going to accept that because times have changed or because they want to be loving or, fill in the blank? How is it that they can do that? Why would they want to make that decision? Well, it's because God's principle, that is wrong, offends the cultural principle that it should be accepted, that it's not wrong, that there's nothing wrong with it. So we have God's priorities, God's principles coming up in contrast with man's principles, and which one supersedes? Well, a lot of times the man's principles supersede, and then they get made into all kinds of wonky doctrines. It's a failure to recognize this truth. They're offended, or they believe that the culture will be offended by what God has to say, so they just change what God has to say. Let's see, where was I? It violates their personal principles, so they deny the true Christ and his true teachings on a particular matter, and they establish the rule based on their principles. They reinterpret Christ to align with their principles. There's a lot of people out there doing it. There's a lot of people who want to have the name of Christ hang over them, but genuinely, they're offended by a lot of the things that he said. They kind of want a part of him, but the rest they're offended at. And Jesus says, blessed is the one who is not offended at the whole true Christ. People can reject what is obvious and spin their own narrative if they find its implications undesirable. So you think about all the works of the Messiah here. There were many people who found offense at the Messiah. Was it because they didn't have evidence? They had people raising from the dead around them. Is it because they didn't have evidence? No, it's not because they didn't have evidence. It's because people can deny or reject what is obvious and spin their own narrative if they find its implications undesirable. I think one of the best examples of this is probably in the creation. Why do people deny that there's a creator? It's because there's no evidence. I live on Guam, and I've been privileged to see a lot of new animals and new plants and things that I had not seen before. And I think it's just brought up a new appreciation for the designer. Is there a lack of evidence in creation that there's a designer? No. It's not. It's the most obvious thing in the world. And to replace it with theories of naturalism that have massive gaping holes in them and that aren't even consistent really with the observable universe is to do what? It's to deny the obvious. Why? Because you don't like the implications that the obvious demands. So you come up with some alternative reality to live in. And that's what these people are doing. They're offended by the implications because they violate their principles or who they want to be. And so we'll just change the world. We'll change what's obvious. We'll put our spin on it and we'll make it into something different that doesn't violate our principles. People reject clear evidence of design because the implications demand adjusting to one's standards or principles. I already talked about that. All right, verse 7 through 10. And as they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Okay, so verse 7 and 8. Jesus now turns his attention off of the disciples of John because they've gone away, and he turns to the audience that's surrounding him, and he asks them a question. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? What does he mean by that? Well, John preached in the wilderness, and we're told that massive amounts of people went out in the wilderness to see him. And so he asks them, still on this topic of John the Baptist, what did you go out there to see? And here we're going to find Jesus, I think, defending John. Because maybe some of these people have had, because of that question that his disciples just asked, maybe some of these people have maybe they have some doubts about, wait a second, John's doubting? Is he fickle? Is he not? Maybe he wasn't who I thought that he was? No, that's not the case. Jesus is about to defend John and really show the people who he was and that he was and is at this time a great man. What did you go out in the wilderness to see? He asks. A reed shaken by the wind? And the rhetorical answer is, no, that's not what you went out to see. What's he mean by a reed shaken in the wind? Have you ever been on a marsh or anywhere where there's a lot of like tall grass or reeds, right? And there's a consistent and steady wind that's blowing. What do you see those reeds do? Well, they bend over in the wind, right? If there's a big gust of wind, they'll bend over even more, and then maybe you'll see them shaking. It's not uncommon to see those reeds out there shaking in the wind because of the breeze. They bend to the will of the forces around them. I think that's the idea that he's getting at here. John wasn't a fickle man. You didn't go out in the wilderness to see a fickle man who just adjusted his message based on what made him comfortable. That's not the case. He wasn't a man who shifted to appease the ever-changing pressures of first century pop culture. He was God's man carrying a timeless message. His message had been prophesied years ago. This is not something that was just culturally adjusted in order to make people happy. You didn't go out to see a reed shaken in the wind. Later in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, he encourages them not to be like this reed shaken in the wind. Ephesians 4 verse 14, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness, by deceit, or in deceitful schemes. By craftiness, in deceitful schemes. We don't want to be blown around all over the place by whatever hits us, this day or next day or the day after that. We want to be firm in our convictions, and John was firm in his convictions, and Jesus is saying that to these people. And again, perhaps they may have thought after hearing John's conviction that, or not his conviction, after hearing his question from his disciples, some people may have been tempted to think that John was fickle. He then asks, a man dressed in soft clothing, did you go out into the wilderness to see a man who was dressed in fine, nice, soft clothing? Again, the rhetorical answer, no. They went out into the wilderness to see a man who had endured the hardship of the Old Testament prophets. The Old Testament prophets taught unpopular messages to a rebellious people. That was the consistent pattern of the prophets in the Old Testament. What is John doing? He's preaching a timeless message, an unpopular message to rebellious people. And they, like John, the Old Testament prophets, were not reeds shaken in the wind. Neither was John. That unwavering nature did not allow them to play politics with those who were in authority or win them comfort and ease by tickling people's ears. If John had wanted to live a more comfortable life, one of the things that he could have done is change his message and not condemn Herod for doing what he did with his brother Philip's wife. He could have kept himself out of jail at least. Maybe that wouldn't be the most comfortable life, but it'd be better than sitting in jail. And the prophets in the Old Testament who interacted with city rulers or authorities or even some of the world rulers probably could have lived a more comfortable life dressed in some more soft clothing if they had been a little bit willing to bend their message in order to appease those rulers. And instead, they taught them the truth that was often hard to accept, and many of them had to live very hard lives because they were unwavering, unbending on their proclamation of the truth. So, did you go out in the wilderness to see a guy who played politics and rub shoulders with rulers and people who lived in luxury and participated in that himself? No. You went out to see a man who's consistent with who the Old Testament prophets were, who took the message of God to the people. All that the prophets had foretold had come to pass and would come to pass. If I could read my own notes. All that the prophets had foretold had come to pass or would come to pass. And here, Jesus affirms the words and the work of John by elevating him above the prophets in verse 11. And we'll dig into that a little bit more as we go on. The prophets of the Old Testament days had long desired to see the Messiah who John was now privileged to announce. So verses 9 and 10, let me read those again. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Jesus has talked about two things that John isn't. He's not a reed out there shaking in the wind. He's not a man who's in comfortable, soft clothing. What is he? He's a prophet. And not only a prophet, but he's a very praised prophet because of the position that he's given. We'll look at in a second. But a prophet, if you're confused about what a prophet is, and there's a lot of misinformation out there, a prophet is just an individual who carries God's message to men. God has a message, he gives it to the prophet takes it to the men and communicates it to them. John was more than a prophet among many. He fills a role that had been prophesied about. John was sent to announce the coming of the Messiah and to prepare the way for Jesus. And Jesus quoted the prophecy in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. Malachi's the last book of the Old Testament. Prophesied about John in chapter 3, verse 1 and chapter 4, verse 5. Also, Luke chapter 1, verse 17 talks about how John came in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Both of those verses are there in the notes if you want to reference them. I think for the sake of time, we will not read them out in their entirety. But Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. All right, verses 11 through 14. Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. We're going to break this down verse by verse because there's a lot going on here. Verse 11, in my understanding, he says that John was greater than all of those born of women before him. Why? When I think of John, I don't necessarily put him on the level of like Abraham, Daniel, Moses, these great prophets in the Old Testament. Maybe that's just my personal bias and opinion, and Jesus seems to correct that thought here. But why is John said to be greater than anyone born of women up to this point? I don't think that John was the greatest because John was less sinful than all of them. I don't think he was the greatest because he was more steadfast, more faithful than all of them, or because he performed more good works than anybody else, but because of his elevated role. He was greater than others because of the position in which God placed him. The Jews had waited on the Messiah for centuries, and John is selected for the very unique privilege of being the prophet who gets to announce that Messiah. And we know and are told in other places, and we'll touch on later, that the prophets really wanted to know about the Messiah, but it wasn't revealed to them. John has the privilege of being the one to announce him. And he was born into that position. He didn't earn it because he was just more righteous than everybody else. He was born for that particular purpose. And it was a position of high honor. In the same way, why does he say that the least in the kingdom of heaven, the least in the church, the least of those redeemed by my blood following his death and resurrection, is greater than John the Baptist? I think the reason is basically the same. Those of us who are privileged to be a part of the kingdom of heaven are not greater than John in the fact that we've sinned less than John, or that we're more steadfast, more faithful than John, or that we've done more good works than John, or we've made more sacrifices than John. We are greater than John because of the honor of receiving the blessing of association with the Son of God. Because of the role that God has put us into. We now hold an extraordinarily privileged position as children of God. And that's not something that John under the old law ever received. And it's not something that people in the Old Testament ever received in their lifetime. Right? They received salvation through the blood of Jesus, yes, moving backwards in time, but have not been privileged to live in the state that we live in and to receive the privilege while alive of being called children of God and brothers of Christ. That's huge. Okay, then let's talk about verse 12. Full disclosure here. I think any honest Bible student would probably admit the same thing here. But I don't ever want to make it appear that the Bible is just easy everywhere. Like, oh yeah, I understand everything in here. That's not true. There are many things in the Bible. In fact, I would say the majority of the things in the Bible, which are very understandable, easy to get your head wrapped around. There's some verses in the Bible that are hard. And I don't ever want to pretend like that's not the case. So full disclosure, this is actually a verse that I find really difficult. And luckily, this is not a verse that I think is going to be like, if you have one view on it, you're going to heaven, and another view on it, you're going to hell. It's not this kind of a verse. But I do want to say, I find this verse difficult, and I hope that maybe we can bring some clarity to it here. And I've added a significant number of notes to help us do that. But the wording here is hard, especially this word violent. And let me read this verse again, verses 12 and 13, actually. Jesus says, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John." Okay, what does that mean? Verse 12, the first part I can make some sense of. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence. Say, okay, how might that be true? If we take a traditional definition of violence, probably the one we all think of when we hear that word, Oh, I actually wrote it down. Let me read it. Using or involving physical force intended to harm, damage, or kill someone or something. That's out of Oxford. That's pretty much the way we all think about violence. Blood, punch somebody in the face, shoot somebody. I don't know. Violence, right? So how has the kingdom of heaven suffered violence from the time of John the Baptist until now, or the time that Jesus is speaking here? Well, I mean, there's been some persecutions as far as there's hostility towards the message of Christ, and that hostility could probably be interpreted as violence. Also, you might even think like the genocide of Herod the Great in chapter 2. That could be seen as violence towards the kingdom of heaven, because the king of the kingdom of heaven had been born, and Herod's trying to eliminate him. So, okay, I can understand that a little bit maybe. And then the second part, though, is what throws me. And the violent take it by force. The violent take the kingdom of heaven by force. I don't understand what that means. I mean, how is that true? Jesus has things under control here. No one's taking over the kingdom. The violent aren't like winning this battle against Christ. Their violence ultimately is going to turn towards, for the good of God and for the bringing about of the kingdom of heaven in the death of Christ and resurrection. So what sense? That doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so can we look at the term violence in another way? Are there any other definitions maybe? And it turns out that there are. And these are probably one that you're familiar with, but they're not the first ones to come to mind. And by the way, if you look in various different Bible translations, they almost all use the word violent. So it's not going to help you to jump to another translation for the most part. Let's look at this alternative definition for violent. And this is also coming from Oxford. Stupid chickens outside making a bunch of noise. He stops, of course, when I put him on the mic. Anyway, this definition is also coming from Oxford, and so it's not just something that I made up here. And that is very strong or powerful. Something that is violent is very strong or powerful. It's intense. And you may be scratching your head like, how do I use that word like that? Let me give you some example sentences I think are helpful. Example sentence number 1. He didn't feel well, and he ran to the bathroom where he became violently sick. Not the most pleasant sentence, but we understand that idea. He's not punching somebody, shooting somebody, doing harm to somebody, and getting sick. It's about the intensity of him being sick. Number 2, she didn't extend her hand, but met her gaze with a glare of violent disdain. So you have a woman who's meeting another woman. She doesn't put out her hand to shake the other woman's hand. She meets her gaze with violent disdain or intense dislike. Or it gets violently cold during the Nova Scotia winter. Again, the cold is not beating people up. It's just that it's an extreme cold. It's not just like it's cold in Ohio or in Tennessee. This is like it's cold in Nova Scotia, way up there in Canada. I don't know why anyone would want to live in that kind of cold, but I say that as I live in Guam. But here, another one, he didn't... I'm going to skip that one. Actually, there's a Bible usage of this term, which is really good. And you're only going to find it in the King James. That's the only place it is translated violent. But in Matthew chapter 8, verse 32, when Jesus is casting out the demon and he sends it into the herd of swine, it says that the herd of swine run down the hillside violently and they run into the sea. And again, that doesn't mean that they were like intentionally doing violence to one another, but I think the idea is they weren't just like trotting with their little pig legs down the hill. They were like full bore. How about that? Full bore down into the lake. Like they're going there and they're going nowhere else and they're going fast, right? They violently ran down. So the Greek word translated, quote, suffered violence in this text is only used one other time in the New Testament, as far as I could find. And it's used in a similar verse, a verse that I actually think is probably a parallel to this one. Luke chapter 16, verse 16 reads like this. The law and the prophets were until John. Since the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. The word translated there, forces, is the Greek word here translated violence or violently. So he's talking about everyone forces his way into it, like this mad rush, kind of like Black Friday shopping, and everyone's trying to violently get through the door. There's a violent rush of people into the door so they can get the best TV deal, which is only probably going to save them $50, but they had to get up at 3 a.m. to do it. So my best understanding of this statement is paraphrased as follows. Since John started preaching, the kingdom of heaven has been the object of violent and intense interest, and multitudes of people have vigorously pressed to be a part of it and take part in it. So to take it for themselves, to lay claim to it, to snatch it up. So rather than talking about doing harm to somebody else, it's talking about the intensity with which they want to be a part of it. Let's read it maybe and try to plug in some of those words and see if they fit. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been the object of great, intense interest. And the violent desire to take part in it by force. You can imagine the crowds that were. Let me read that. And the people have a violent and intense desire to take it by force, to be a part of it, to take it for themselves. To be included. You can imagine the multitudes of thousands of people surrounding Jesus. There may have been kind of this intense jockeying for position to get close to Jesus, maybe to touch the hem of his garment or something like that, to be healed, or just to hear his words, just to be close to the Messiah. There was probably a lot of that going on, and so maybe it would have been something understandable. And so that's my best understanding of that verse. It's to translate violently there as the second alternative definition of powerful or intense or strong. I'm not super in love with it. Like, it's not one of those things I just feel like I have nailed down and it's the perfect explanation. That seems to be the explanation that most commentators take. And I don't see a better explanation. Maybe you've heard one, and I'd love to hear it down in the comments below. But just the wording on that verse is kind of hard for me. So verses 13 through 14 then. For all the people and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. All of the cherished prophets of the Old Testament pointed to the time in which Christ was now living, pointed to the time of John and of Jesus and the establishment of the kingdom. And Jesus calls the people to accept the prophecies that we talked about in Malachi, chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 4, verse 5, that told of the coming Elijah. And he says here, excuse me, that John is that Elijah. John is the Elijah who was prophesied to come. John bore a strong resemblance to Elijah, and I think we've talked about this maybe in another video. But Luke chapter 1, verse 17 says that he possessed the spirit and the power of Elijah. And this may have been difficult for some Jews to understand because it seems like, and I've read a few places, and the biblical text seems to bring to light the fact that maybe the Jewish leaders were teaching that Elijah himself, like actually Elijah the prophet, was going to come back to Israel before the Messiah came. So they were like, okay, we're waiting for Elijah to show back up. Jesus interprets that Elijah in more of a figurative, more symbolic, that's probably a better word. That Elijah is symbolic, and John is filling that symbolic role of being the prophet Elijah. But seems like in verses like Matthew chapter 16, verse 14, and Matthew chapter 17, verse 10, that the Jews had in their mind that an actual physical appearance of the prophet Elijah was what had to happen before the Messiah was coming. And you read those verses, and Jesus is asking his disciples who others think he is. And in Matthew 16, 14, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Matthew chapter 17, verse 10, and the disciples asked him, then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? So you have these doctors of the law, the scribes, they're teaching Elijah's actually going to show up here. And you think that may that may have made a lot of sense in the Jewish mind, that it would be Elijah who would come back. Why? Because if you know the story of Elijah in the Old Testament, Elijah didn't die. He's one of the, I think, only 2 people who didn't actually physically die. God takes Elijah at the end of his life up into heaven in a flaming chariot. So they might be thinking, hey, Elijah never died. Why? Because he has to come back, right? But that's not the way that the verse is. They weren't intended to make that connection, right? And Jesus makes that clear here. And so if Jesus was presenting a new way to think about the Elijah who was to come, and he's saying that that's actually John, not the way that the scribes have traditionally interpreted this, then his next statement, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. That makes a lot of sense. They needed to have ears to hear this story presented in a different way. The scribes didn't have the understanding that they thought they had. Jesus was going to present this in a new way. They needed to have ears that were teachable in order to see things the way that God had actually set them up and not the way that the scribes had taught them for so long. I think there's a good lesson here about rigid perspective when we read the Bible. We need to have an open mind to approach a scripture from more than just one angle, namely the angle that we've always heard it from. I find myself sometimes, I've heard a verse taught for so long in one way that that's all I can see. I just can't see anything else. And it really takes a lot of work for me to open my mind and say, okay, is there another way to see this passage? Could it be saying something else? Could it be saying something in addition to what I've gotten out of it in the past? And obviously we still need to take care to make sure that the angles from which we approach these texts are biblical and literally correct. Literally correct. Maybe that's what I wanted. Because we want to be good interpreters, responsible interpreters. We don't just want to come to a text and pull whatever we want out of it, right? But sometimes we limit the way that we look at a scripture, not because the Bible limits the passage, but because it's limited by some theological bias or religious or from our religious upbringing. A mind that is open to different perspectives is open to God's instruction through the word, no matter where that word leads. So just a thought there in those verses. So verses 15 through 19 now. We'll read 15 again. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their playmates. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came, neither eating nor drinking, and they said, he has a demon. The Son of Man came, eating and drinking, and they said, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. So verse 15, where he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Jesus is addressing this generation, specifically those of them that reject him, specifically targeting, well, no, I'm leaving that off. He says that this generation would not have been satisfied or have been accepting of the message, no matter who it came from, no matter what the messenger looked like. So think about this. John has just come. Jesus has just come. They've presented the gospel in not different ways, but they themselves have presented in different ways. And they're teaching the same gospel. And Jesus is saying, look, it wouldn't matter who brought this message to you. You wouldn't accept him. And he gives an illustration here. He compares them to children who are playing with some companions. And some of the children thought that their playmates would enjoy a happy tune. And so they get out their flute and they start playing a happy tune on their flute. But their playmates don't respond. Evidently, they're not happy. They don't want to dance. Assuming that they must be in a sorrowful mood, the children change the happy tune to a dirge. And a dirge is a mournful song, a piece of music, or a poem. Sad music. Oh, our friends aren't dancing to the happy music. They must be sad. We'll play sad music instead and we'll mourn with them. But their playmates don't respond to that either. Two different tunes, two vastly different perspectives or presentations, and no response. Okay. With similar variety, John and Jesus had brought the gospel and presented differently. John preached the gospel while living apart from people, living in the wilderness, an uncomfortable life, and probably without an abundance of food. If you're eating locusts, you don't have Oreos sitting around, right? You're living off what the land gives you. On the other hand, Jesus preached the gospel while living among people, living in a city, and being willing to eat in people's houses if he was invited, like the tax collectors in chapter 10. Was that 10? Maybe it was 9 when he went to Matthew's house. But some rebellious Jews rejected the gospel that was preached by both. They weren't open to the message no matter where it came from and what the messenger looked like. They mocked John as having a demon, thought he was probably a crazy guy walking around out here in the wilderness wearing animal hair. And they accused Jesus of associating with sinners and drunkards and just being one of them. And so we have two vastly different presentations, the same message, both get rejected. Some application there for us to think about. Some people are not interested in truth, no matter how it's presented. You may take all this time to prepare the truth or a presentation in just the right way. You're not going to reach everybody. I don't care if that's the best written, best drawn, best video edited presentation ever. There's going to be some people just not interested because they're not interested in truth. That's just not their top priority. That's true for non-believers. It's also true for believers. Non-believers, maybe they want to go off and live in some particular way, and that's their highest priority in some sin. And look, truth is just not that important to them. Pleasure, passion, personal interest is their greatest priority. You're not going to be able to reach those people, no matter how you present. Also for religious people, there's some religious people who, again, maybe because of religious bias or theological upbringing or something like that they're only interested in hearing what they already think that they know. They're only interested in hearing what they already believe to be true. And no matter how well or how lovingly you approach those people, they will not surrender because they're living for their heritage or their pride, perhaps. And truth is secondary to that. They do not have ears to hear. Another application is similar in a lot of ways, but if someone wants to reject God and the good news that God is giving and that he sent into the world, they will always be able to find a reason to do it. And that doesn't need to be a good reason. It just needs to be something that's good enough for them to believe and to buy into or to pass off to somebody and not have to really dedicate that much thought to. We need to find people who have ears to hear. We've probably all met people who don't have ears for listening, right? They have ears. They hear what they want to hear and are willing to intake information that is consistent with what they want to hear. But their ears aren't for learning. They're never going to take in some new information and consider it and mull over it and meditate on it and study it and come to some new conclusion because of something new that they've heard. If things that are new, things that don't comport, aren't consistent with what they already think they know, just go right out the other ear. Not interested in that. That's false. Not going to believe it. Not interested. So that's not to say that people who do not have ears to hear at one point in their lives will never have ears to hear. My wife actually just on Facebook the other day put up a post about a time when she was 18 and was trying to find her satisfaction in everything other than God and had grown up in the church, familiar with it, and had just rebelled against it. Didn't have ears to hear God saying, "You will only find your satisfaction in me." But after some circumstances in her life, her ears were open to that truth, and having not found her satisfaction in the world, she came to God and her ears were open at that point. So it's not to say you're writing people off, but there are people at times in their lives, they're just not interested in hearing it. There may be times in their lives later on when they are, and we've got to be willing to at least maybe plant a seed that they won't think about again for 5 years, but that seed will be there and they'll know, at least have a direction in which to look when It's finally time for new truth to enter their ears and be considered. All right. Where are we? Jesus didn't spend all of his time talking to those who didn't have ears to hear or eyes to see. And we need to pray for people's ears to be open and search out people who are ready to listen now. Make sure not to skip over Jesus' statement in verse 19. I actually think the more I study this text, that tiny statement might be one of the most significant statements in the entire chapter, if not in the book of Matthew. And we'll explain that a little bit here, but the statement is this: yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. Wisdom is justified by our deeds. You've rejected the outward appearance of both John and myself, but wisdom is not in your outward appearance, not in your externals. It's in your deeds, the fruit of the tree. That's where you're going to find wisdom. And let me read my notes here. I think it's stated better. I think what he is saying here is that the truth of his and John's message shouldn't be evaluated by picking apart the outward appearance of the messenger, but by an examination of the messenger's actions and life, their deeds. The Jews denied John and Jesus because of their outward appearance, but Matthew in his gospel has already begun making the case that Jesus' life, his deeds, are consistent with everything that the Messiah was supposed to be. As eyewitnesses, the Jews to whom Jesus was speaking would have been able to observe the life of Jesus, his miracles, his teachings, his deeds, and conclude that his life was evidence that he possessed true wisdom. The Jews look out at the externals of these two and they're like, look, this is not what we were expecting. And because of that, we've determined that these men don't have any wisdom. They're not actually from God. They're not the people who you should be looking for. Jesus is saying, wrong. Your evaluation standard is wrong. This is a lot of what he's getting at when he says, judge not that you be not judged, but judge righteous judgment. The standard on which you're evaluating is incorrect, and you're fooling all of these people around you because you've convinced them that you have the right facade and it's all external and there's nothing internal. I am going to come and I'm going to show you that real godly wisdom is found in those whose deeds are consistent with God. And that's John and I. It's not you, Jewish leaders. And wisdom will be justified. Which one of us has true wisdom? It will be shown by the actions that we take as we preach this message. Application. Sometimes we look at our lives, getting back to this idea of wisdom can't always be judged based off the externals, the part we see. Sometimes we look at our lives and they aren't turning out the way that we thought that they would. Externally, they look wrong. Like, this is not the life that I had envisioned. It's going sideways. Outwardly, they're not what we had dreamed up. But as long as we are faithful to God, we can be confident that through his actions and deeds, he will reveal that he has true wisdom. Think about it. In the past, God has confirmed, not only in our lives, who are faithful believers, but also in his work throughout all of the world and bringing about the plan of redemption, that even when things don't look like they're going the way that we thought that they were going to go, God's wisdom and his deeds in working through those circumstances, they put his wisdom on display. Right? People must have been scratching their head like, okay, Jesus just died like the apostles, and everything is ruined now. And what would God say to them? Wisdom is justified by her deeds. It may not appear correct to you on the outside, but God, through this action, is going to prove that he's the one who has real wisdom. The world thought that they killed Jesus. God's like, no, you just played into my hands. And through my work, you're going to be able to see that I'm the one who has the eternal wisdom. I'm the one who's guiding people properly. And just because the outside looks a little funny to you doesn't mean that God's not at work on the backside of things. If things turned out the way, some people get so worried that things aren't turning out the way that they had hoped, and they're like, everything is going to be ruined. False. If you're being faithful to God, then by him not working in the way that you thought he should work, he's revealing that he's working in a different way, and he wouldn't do that except for the fact that his way has more wisdom in it than your way. I hope that made some sense. Maybe it didn't. You're just totally confused. But you cannot always look at the outside. The Jews were looking at the outside of the way that the Messiah was presenting, and they were like, this isn't what we thought. This can't be right. This can't be the work of God. Jesus is saying, look at my deeds. This isn't the way that you planned. This isn't the way that you thought, but this is where real wisdom is. And so what needs to happen? Their perspective needs to change. It's not that God needs to act the way that they expected him to act. Their perspective needs to change to embrace the true wisdom and to see the wisdom of God in the actions of Christ. A lot of times we try to do it in reverse. We're like, you know what? It's not working out the way I had hoped. I'm going to force it to work out the way that I had hoped. God needs to come up and meet me on my level. What does that say? I have a greater wisdom than God has. Wrong. And so if we're being faithful to God and things aren't going our way, we ought to assume, based on the precedent of God's deeds in the past, that whatever he's doing, there's a whole lot more wisdom in it than what we thought he should be doing. Again, I hope I didn't just confuse you to no end. God has confirmed his wisdom through his deeds in our personal lives and in his work throughout time. Better to live a life guided by the wisdom of God that doesn't turn out the way we expected and Let me read that again. Better to submit to a life guided by the wisdom of God that doesn't turn out the way that we expected than to live a life guided on human wisdom that looks exactly like what we wanted. That's the whole point here. How often do we think we know who God wants us to be? Just like the Jews thought that they knew who God's Messiah was going to be. What they needed to do was to open their ears and open their hearts to God's wisdom and not resist God by believing that they knew better. Same for us. Same truth in application for us as well. That brings us down to verse 20. Verse 20 through 24. Then he began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. So Jesus, Well, the Jews weren't satisfied with anything. They weren't satisfied with Jesus. They weren't satisfied with John. And Jesus rebukes them for that in one of his strongest and most stern rebukes in the Gospel of Matthew yet. He specifically targets the towns right around Galilee. That makes sense because he had spent most of his time there. Most of his miracles had been performed there. And he especially targets Capernaum and Chorazin and Bethsaida. So Bethsaida and Chorazin are the first up, and you can see those on your map that's in the notes. They're highlighted in red, and the cities of Tyre and Sidon that we'll talk about are highlighted in green. These towns had a unique privilege of witnessing more of the miracles and hearing more of the words of Jesus than almost anybody else. And if anyone had had sufficient evidence to believe in Christ, it would have been them. And yet they continued to reject the Messiah. Chorazin and Bethsaida are condemned first. Jesus says that their condemnation will be worse than the cities of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were mostly, from what I've read, Gentile cities. They did seem like maybe they had some Jewish population in them, but mostly Gentile. So you think they weren't expecting a Messiah. And yet Jesus says, if I had showed up there, showed them these mighty works, they would have believed. Why? Think about why. Maybe it's because they didn't have any preconceived ideas about who the Messiah was going to be. They might have heard of a Messiah coming. In fact, the Syrophoenician woman, who we'll talk about, I believe, in chapter 14, accepts Christ as the Messiah. But why would they have repented and the Jews didn't? I think it might have been just because they didn't have any preconceived ideas about who the Messiah was going to be. They didn't have any theological baggage that they were dragging along that they had been taught by people who maybe they thought could be trusted, like the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And that hindered a lot of people from accepting Jesus. Tyre and Sidon, Gentiles, they didn't have any of that. What did they look at? Evidence. Evidence. Jesus does miracles, raises the dead. Like, this guy's the Messiah. No question about it. I think that's part of the reason the Gentiles maybe were more willing to accept Jesus. And I think that's really important, because is it not true that bad teaching, bad theological teaching in our past can keep us from accepting the teachings of the Bible in the Christ as he truly displays himself and what he wants us to be in the Bible? I think that's definitely true. We have thoughts. Religion should be this way. The Bible says it. Does it really? This is who the Messiah would be. The Old Testament says it, says the scribes. Does it really? Jesus is saying, it doesn't. The scribes are wrong. What you've been taught is wrong. You need to have ears to hear. The Gentiles accept, because all they do is look at the evidence. That's what he wants John to do. Look at the evidence. That's what he wants the Jews to do. Look at the evidence. The evidence will prove. My deeds will prove that wisdom is with me. Moving on. Verses 23 through 24. In what appears to be maybe even a stronger rebuke, Jesus denounces Capernaum, which was his place of residence. It was his home, if he had a home. They had probably witnessed even more miracles, heard even more sermons than Chorazin and Bethsaida. And he sets their judgment up against one of the most notoriously wicked cities ever, Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe this is your first time studying the Bible, or you've never studied the Bible before. It's possible you've heard of Sodom and Gomorrah, because it's a byword. It's just like a word that is almost meant to represent like deplorable evil, Sodom and Gomorrah. And they were destroyed by God because they were so evil. Genesis 13, verse 13 says, now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. I don't know if that's said about anybody else, but great sinners. Jesus says, even Sodom would have repented if they had witnessed the work that God did in Capernaum. Yikes. That's kind of scary. That's really scary for the people that were there. And because of their obstinance, Capernaum would receive an even harsher punishment than the one of this most wicked city. Why? Because they had received the most revelation. Right? They had received the most evidence. I think there's a good application there for us. Jesus condemns those who received a greater revelation of God and still persisted in rebellion. Should that not be a warning to us who now have in the scriptures, in being able to observe the plan of redemption from the beginning of time until its fulfillment in Christ on the cross, and being told, what's coming as far as the judgment day, as far as knowing about the grace of Christ? We have a fuller revelation than anyone who lived before Jesus. Even the people who Jesus is talking to here in this text, because they hadn't seen the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the establishment of the kingdom in Acts chapter 2, all of the works of the kingdom, and yet we can read about all of those things and see how it all intertwines so perfectly together. And so should that not be, or this condemnation should be seriously considered by all of us who live in a time when the redemption of God has been fully revealed. Those of us who are privileged to understand the redeeming work of God in its fullness may also be judged more harshly if we choose to turn away. Super important. Not something to be taken lightly. All right, let's finish this chapter off, verse 25 through 30. At that time, Jesus declared, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. First two verses there. After his condemnation of these cities, he says, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. Jesus turns his attention from the cities, from his audience, condemning them, and he directs it towards God. And, maybe looking up to heaven here, he says, I don't know if it says that in the text or not. No, doesn't. But he seems like this would be a statement where you look up to heaven at least. He says that he's thankful for the way that the gospel has been delivered. In that, it blinds the wise and it is open and accessible to little children. What's going on here? Now, I've heard some people use this text to say, oh, well, look, this is evidence that you can only be saved, if you're elect of God. If God shows you, reveals the truth, because you've been blinded, right? And so only particular people are unblinded from this. And I don't think that's what Jesus is saying, particularly for the statement, because of the statement in verse 28, where he gives an open invitation to all who will come. He says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That's an open invitation. Whoever is burdened and heavy laden, come to me, and I will give you rest. If that's not an open invitation, it seems like Jesus is maybe being a little bit deceitful in offering that to people. But what is he saying here? He's saying that people are blinded by the simplicity and the humility of the gospel. The simplicity and humility of the gospel message is hidden in plain sight from those who believe themselves to be too wise to accept it. Do we have anybody in this text that might be like that? Yeah. The scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees all believe themselves to be too sophisticated for the simple preaching of this Jew from Nazareth. They expected a Savior with a little bit more flourish, maybe a little bit more formal training like they had received. He did, who's this guy who didn't go through Jewish preaching school, Jewish seminary, never went to our rabbinical schools, at least as far as we know. And when they didn't get it, they told John that he was a crazy man. And then they told Jesus that he was a drunkard and he liked to hang out with sinners and that he didn't know anything about the Jewish God. Look, you don't know nothing. John, you got a bunch of crazy people walking around. People, if you want to learn about God, where do you need to look? To your old faithful scribes and Pharisees who are the experts in the law, will tell you about who God is. That's important. Jesus is not using wise here and understanding to refer to people with genuine wisdom. He's using it kind of in a sarcastic way. Not that there's humor behind it, but in a sarcastic way, in that if they had genuinely been wise and understanding, they would have looked at Jesus' deeds and accepted the heavenly wisdom. If they were genuinely wise, they would have had ears to hear. So we go back to that one little statement in that passage, wisdom is justified by our deeds. They would have been able to see Jesus' deeds, like Matthew is trying to prove to them here. And they would have been able to say, oh, maybe this isn't what we thought it was. Maybe it doesn't look like we thought it was going to look, but this is the Messiah. They couldn't do that. They were not genuinely wise. Jesus uses these terms in a sarcastic way. We already talked about that. They genuinely believe themselves to be wise, but genuinely they were fools. In contrast, he talks about the little children. Actually, I think I have that in my notes a little bit further down. We'll discuss some application here. If you fancy yourself to be wise, but are not open to being taught, then you are not wise. If you fancy yourself to be wise, but you aren't willing to be taught, if you don't have ears to hear, you're not wise. If you already believe that you know everything that there is to know about a particular subject and aren't willing to take input from any other sources, you may be terribly mistaken about what you actually think that you know. The Jewish elite had spent a lifetime studying their law, and they were terribly misguided about the true meaning of it and the God who had delivered it. Think about it. Who do we generously? No. What is the word I want? Who do we consider an expert to be? An expert on any topic. What would be a qualification of a world-renowned expert? It's probably that he spent his entire life in a particular field. He's very specialized. He's very good. He studied harder than anybody else, right? He knows all the facts surrounding a particular subject. He's dedicated his life to this. He's an expert. Well, you think the Jews here, they think that they are experts about the Jewish law. But I think that there is a really important point to be seen here. And that is that you can be extremely educated and extremely unwise. Those two things are not the same. You can be extremely educated, but at the same time, extremely unwise. And that's the situation that we have here. Who do we go to when we want information about a particular subject? To an expert, right? So the tendency of people, especially the Jews, might have been to go where when they wanted to know something about the Jewish law, when they wanted to know something about God, think, who should I go to? The Pharisees and the scribes are like, come to the experts, baby. We know all this stuff. We've been talking about the Torah and the written law, the oral law, the Talmud and the other Mishnah and the other one. And we've spent our lives talking about this, debating about this, commentating on this, preaching this to other people. You want to know about God? You come to us. We're the experts. Jesus says, be careful about that thinking. Be careful in thinking that they have wisdom. We'll get into that. Hold on. I'm gonna preach the end of this Bible lesson. Jesus used the term little children here in contrast to those who thought themselves wise and understanding. Little children is referring to those who in simplicity and in humility have open hearts and ears to accept the teaching of the gospel. And you have to have a level of humility to accept that you're not the greatest thing in the universe and that God is the greatest thing in the universe and that you ought to accept things the way that he presents them instead of the way that you've thought about them for so long. Reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 29, where Paul talks about, I'll read it. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to the worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. Why? So that no human being might boast in the presence of God. To put God's greatness on display. Not human greatness on display, not human wisdom or expertise or study or knowledge or collection of facts. Verse 27 through 30. It wasn't the wise, quotation marks, and understanding that could show the people the Father. They did not even know who the Father was. Jesus has already said that in the scriptures. You think you're children of Abraham. You think you know the Father. You do not know the Father. And they didn't know his heart and they didn't know his character. And the work of making the Father known to the world was given to who? To Christ. He says, no one knows the Father except through me. No one knows the Son except through the Father. There's this unity in the divinity. And it is Christ, God come to tabernacle on earth to live with mankind, John chapter 1, who's going to communicate what God is really like. Because I'm going to not follow my notes. No, I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow my notes. Christ is given that responsibility. Why? Because it needs to be communicated. Because over the last several hundred years, it's been butchered by people who claim wisdom, but whose deeds do not justify their wisdom. He says, his deeds manifested the wisdom of the Father, and those who came to him like little children could learn from him. One of the things that they would learn was that Christ and the Father were kind masters. They were not like the taskmaster Jewish elite who gave their fellow Jews burdens that were too heavy to bear. Matthew chapter 23, verse 4, Jesus will talk about the scribes and Pharisees, and he says this, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger, right? They're not even not even willing to give a finger to help somebody bear their burden. And unlike these, Jesus was prepared and was preparing himself to bear the heaviest burden so that we could be relieved of the weight of sin, the weight of our sin. And in accomplishing this for us, he would reveal himself and the Father to the Jewish world who didn't know him, and ultimately a Gentile world, and ultimately a Gentile world that was coming to know him for the first time. The world needed to know who God was. Who were they going to go to? This is the great question of the Gospels, right? And all of Jesus' work with the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and the battle between him and them in the scriptures. Who actually knew God and was able to reveal God to the people? Contrast the actions or the lack of actions of the Pharisees and scribes with Jesus' statement here when he's talking about the yoke. He says, learn from me. Take my yoke upon me, take my yoke upon you and do what? Learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart. Jesus was going to make their yoke light by doing the heavy lifting, not by placing burdens on people. He was going to sacrifice to bring them to God. But the Pharisees wouldn't even help people in their own walk with God. All of the oppressed are invited to come to Jesus and find relief. So as we bring this to a close, I want you to think about all that this really means here. We have Jesus pitted against the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees who represent that old works-based law that no one can keep properly. But what do they think they are? They think that they're the experts. We are the experts. We devoted our lives to this. We know what's going on in this Old Testament law. Come to us and we will tell you what it's like. And by the way, when the Messiah gets here, he's going to look exactly like what we taught you, because that's what God looks like. Against Jesus. And Jesus is on this side saying, I'm going to show you what God actually looks like. God is not an oppressive God who lays burdens on you. He's not just about keeping the rules for keeping the rules' sake. He's more interested not just in the externals, but also in the internals in the heart. And not only is he going to tell you how to get to God, he's going to help you get to God. And so who's the expert in this situation? Jesus says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Come and learn from me. What are we going to learn from Christ about God, about who he is that the Pharisees did not teach us? It's just what we talked about. This God is gentle. He's loving. He is going to make the sacrifices to bring us to him, not the other way around. Who are you going to listen to, Jews? The experts who claim to be wise, who have devoted their life to something, who are so educated that they've become fools? Or are you going to listen and are you going to have ears to accept a Messiah who may not look exactly like who you thought he was going to look like, but whose wisdom is justified by his deeds, unlike these people who have no deeds, they have no action, they have no work, they help no one? Will the wisdom of God be revealed through them, or will it be revealed through the deeds of the Messiah? That's what's going to happen. And not only the deeds that he's already done and helping to bear people's burdens and helping to make life easier on them, but ultimately in the cross, right? This is what God is actually like. He bears the burdens for his people. He gives them grace so that they can be redeemed. What does that mean for us? As we look, we're almost in the middle of Matthew. As we look at this passage that reveals the huge contrast between the Pharisees and Jesus, the Jewish system and Jesus, the Old Testament and, the abused Old Testament and the message of Jesus, what can we learn from that in application? And I think there's a couple things. When we communicate the nature of the Father, that's what Jesus is doing here. I will show you who the Father is. These people don't even know the Father. When we communicate that nature of the Father to people, do we teach them like the Pharisees or do we teach them like the Son of God? Do we not have a finger to assist them? Or do we lay down our lives to bear their burdens to make it easier for them to get to God? Do we preach about the sacrifices and the crosses and the burdens that people need to bear? Do we preach about the condemnation of those who don't do those things properly? People who aren't doing it right. People who need to get their lives together and get themselves in order. But we aren't willing to help them bear any burden that they have to carry. We don't spend our time bearing the burdens of other people. Whose interpretation of the Father is that if we preach the gospel that way? If it's just about you got to do all these things, but I'm not here to help you. I like to get online and condemn people because they're not doing stuff right, but I'm not offering anybody any help. Whose interpretation of the Father and of the gospel is that? It's the Pharisees. It's the scribes. Question then. Well, statement first. The Jewish leaders, when they said, learn from me, they said, I'll tell you how to get to God. I'll tell you how to be right with God. Jesus, when he says, learn from me, different story. What is he doing? He says, I will help you get to God. When we approach somebody else with the gospel, whether it's online or in person or in a pulpit in a congregation, the way that we say, learn from me, really matters. Are we going to tell somebody, I'll tell you how to get to God, but I'm not going to offer you any help? Are we going to say, learn from me because I learned from Jesus and he taught me about the Father and who he is, and you learn from me how to get to God and I will help you get there? That's preaching Christ properly. That's preaching the Messiah properly. Is it fair to say that we ought not preach the gospel if we aren't ready to bear the burdens of those who we teach? Is it fair to say that we do not know the Father if we preach a gospel that doesn't compel us to bear one another's burdens? I think the answer to that is yes. We do not understand the nature of God if we preach constant condemnation to people, but we are not constantly working and helping to construct people into who God wants them to be, and helping them with the burdens that they bear, because it's difficult to live the way that we're supposed to. Did Jesus know that? Yeah, he died for us to make it possible. There's other people going to have burdens to bear. Obviously, Christ has taken away the ultimate burden. But in our lives and in coming to him, there are burdens that we are instructed in the scriptures to bear for one another. And if we count that as just kind of extra to the gospel, like we just need to get them dunked in the water and get their Christian label on them, but we're not going to help them to, I'm not going to help them bear the burdens after that actually happens. If that's the gospel that you preach and you promote, and that bearing burdens is an extra measure, you do not know God. That's what Jesus is saying. Who are we going to listen to? And ultimately, who are we going to be? What do people need to see from us? They need to see us preach the gospel like Jesus, not like the Pharisees. Otherwise, it's going to feel like what the Jews felt like under the Pharisees' reign. Like, oh, we just have all this stuff and none of us can keep it perfectly. We need to preach the gospel like Jesus and then help people to bear the burdens that we all bear as we try to follow Christ and live for him. So I'm done ranting. I think that's hugely important, though. And I've gone an hour and a half. What are you going to do? Well, if you haven't subscribed to this channel and you'd like to hear me rant more, you can do that. Subscribe down on YouTube. Remember, it's out on podcast. Also, remember to share these videos and give them a thumbs up. That helps with the whole YouTube algorithm, getting these things promoted and whatnot. Leave some comments down below. There's plenty of stuff to comment on here, and I'd be interested in hearing your feedback on that and any other observations from this text. But again, I think this is a pivotal chapter in defining the absolute difference between Christ and legalism and the old law and its abuse.